Hi everyone, here's Toby from the International Association for Political Science Students. We are here live from San Francisco, from the annual convention of the International Studies Association. And with me today is Amitav Acharya. And I'm very happy that you are with us today to talk with us about your work, your professional career, and what you're researching right now. And mainly, we want to start with your current research on rethinking power, institutions, and ideas in world politics. What is this about?
Yeah, I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to discuss my work. The phrase you just mentioned, rethinking power, institutions, and ideas in world politics. It's a book about basically what the title suggests. It's how power, how institutions, and how ideas shape world politics. But I provide an alternative interpretation of how these three basic determinants of world politics, power, institutions, and ideas, are the three kind of basic forces driving world politics. And I give a non-conventional or a revisionist interpretation of these driving forces. And in each case, so for example, in the case of power, a lot of people associate power with physical power, military power, and there is some truth to it. I am not saying military power is irrelevant, but I think what I talk about is how power is exercised in more of a normative way. And soft power may be one way of putting it, but I don't use the term soft power. But I'm also looking at how these concepts, the concept of power, works out in relation to the non-Western world. So, in fact, a lot of my work and the common thread running through this book, a lot of my other work, is how concepts that were developed in the West actually have a different meaning and different way of operating, working out in the non-Western world. So what is a legitimate exercise of power in the Western world may not be so in a non-Western world. When the West talks about the war on terror, and I think it's legitimate because fighting terrorism is important for national security, which is a corollary of power, I say that it's not as legitimate. The way the war on terror is fought, actually, and especially being fought in the world today, is not very legitimate. And especially if you look at it from the prism of the people in the non-Western world. And similarly, when it comes to relationships of power, like the Cold War was the relationship of power. So the Western interpretation of the Cold War is that Cold War was a long period of peace because US and the Soviet Union, despite the tension, managed the affairs of the world in a bipolar system. And it kept the world from having World War III. And there was no war, major war. But my interpretation is that was actually pretty bad for the developing a non-Western world. A lot of regional conflicts. There was no nuclear war or no war in Europe, but there were wars everywhere else in the Third World. Same with the institutions. The kind of institutions, like people think European Union is the perfect institution, a perfect model of regionalism. And my argument is that maybe so for Europe, but that model doesn't work in non-Western world. Countries like in Southeast Asia, they have their own model of regionalism called ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And same for ideas. The way ideas work, what kind of ideas, whose ideas, they may be, ideas may mean one thing in the West, different thing in the non-Western world. So the meaning of human rights, democracy, or development, security have different meanings in the non-West as opposed to the West. So this whole book is a way of reinterpreting three basic forces shaping world politics. So power, institutions, and ideas.
Thank you. You've studied and taught in Canada, South Africa, the US, Thailand, the UK, if I got it right. Yeah. A lot of different places which probably all have slightly different interpretations of concepts. But I wonder, when was the point where you realized for yourself that you want to study non-Western IR, or that there is something as non-Western IR that researchers have not really thought about? What was your motivation?
I think if I want to put a kind of a date and a time to it, it has to be 1999-2000, when I was teaching a graduate seminar in Canada at York University. And I felt that reading through the text of international relations, and it's a PhD seminar which you teach all the foundational texts to your graduate students, PhD students. And although I had read a lot of these things when I was a student, but teaching them to my students, I certainly realized that somehow they didn't make as much sense to me now than they did when I was actually a student. And I think a lot of these are very Western-centric. I realized that international relations is very ethnocentric. It reflects not only the history and ideas of the West, but it also assumes that those ideas are superior to those of the ideas of the non-West. I also felt that non-Western countries, their history, or post-colonial countries, their history, their philosophy, their contributions are completely ignored in these big narratives of realism, liberalism, or constructivism. So that's what got me to be curious about it. And one of the first papers I've written on this subject is called Ethnocentrism and Emancipatory IR Theory. How IR theory cannot be emancipatory, meaning cannot liberate people from the prism of a certain type of thinking, because it is beholden to the particular experience of the West. And then I took it on and developed it. Then I moved to Singapore, and I did a project on non-Western IR theory with Professor Barry Bujan. And then I moved to the United States, where I became the president of the International Studies Association, and that was my presidential theme. Although by then I call it global IR rather non-Western IR, because non-Western is kind of a negative, the West versus the rest, or the global is more inclusive.
That actually brings me pretty straight to my next question, because I was wondering whether you think that if you say non-Western IR is a concept that we should rethink, and we should talk about whether it's really a good definition. Is Western IR something we should also rethink, or is Western IR one component of IR theory, or is Western IR something that has to be overcome itself? What do you think?
That's a very fundamental question. So the whole discipline of international relations is very heavily dominated by Western ideas and Western experience and concepts derived from Western history. So that's European history and also the United States in more recent times. And although we call it international relations, it's not really international. It's one part of the international. And I do not want to see those knowledge disappear. I think those are valuable knowledge, and but they can be broadened and redefined. They can be infused with the ideas and contributions and histories of non-Western societies. So it's not West versus the rest. It's West with the rest, really. That's what and that's why I call it global IR. And so unlike some scholars, there are some scholars of critical theorists or post-colonial scholars who basically want to have a fresh start for IR. And they think the current IR discipline knowledge is too contaminated. It's too much of a baggage. We should start all over again, reboot the discipline. I think that's not practical, and that's also not necessary, because we can actually challenge the Western IR theory to become more broad, more inclusive, by incorporating and engaging with non-Western histories and experiences. And sometimes, we can have both. But the idea is not to keep them separate, but to blend them together, so that the discipline becomes more inclusive, less ethnocentric.
We have one question, and I would encourage you to raise even more questions. LS is asking us why Western countries have such a control in this regard. And maybe this should also be related to, if I may say something about my personal experience. When I studied abroad in India, I was seeing that actually, even though there was a very different mindset in international relations, how it was taught, the concepts that were applied were actually the Western concepts in many ways.
That's an excellent question. So I don't take a book to explain that, but I think broadly that's the essence of what I have been working on for the last 15 years or so. So the reason why IR is Western dominated, and in fact you can have been more specific, it's American dominated. I mean, Stanley Hoffman, the late professor at Harvard, said international relations is an American social science. Although it was born in Europe, I mean, the first chair in international relations international politics was founded just under 100 years ago. It will be next year 100 years. It was in the University of Wales in Aberystwyth, and in 1919. Then United States becomes a global hegemon, and IR becomes kind of an American social science. United States dominates IR and makes it more scientific, gives it an identity. But why is that? First, power. It is not a coincidence that the discipline was founded in Britain, which was the global hegemon in 1919, still was, and then become American dominated because the United States was the #1 power. So there is a clear relationship between power and knowledge when it comes to IR. But related to that, there is resources, the universities, departments, journals, big publishers, book publishers. They are all concentrated in the West. And the United States is now, since the Second World War, is the nucleus of all this, because all the big journals and Britain has Oxford and Cambridge, but they make a lot of their money out of the United States. And so all this, the power, the institutions, the resources, departments of training are all concentrated in the West. And but there are other things. This sort of creates an intellectual hegemony, because once you have a head start, you create all these theories based on the Western model, like balance of power from, say, 18th or 19th century Europe, ideas of a liberal order from British, American practices of free trade. So you develop these concepts from the particular experience of the West, Europe, and the United States, but you found them universal. Applies to all. And then you institutionalize it. You will teach them through curriculums, textbooks, which are all written and published mostly in the West. So it creates a hegemony, and it's very hard to break that. In the non-Western world, the reverse is the true. That many, until recently, very few departments, very few resources, very few journals. So they send a lot of the students to the West. They get trained in all this Western thinking and the Western lore, mindset, and they reproduce that when they go back. So the story goes on. And one more thing I would say, which is particular to the United States, but not to Europe, is there is a revolving door between academia and policy. So a lot of professors, like Henry Kissinger, or Madeleine Albright, or Condoleezza Rice, but the list goes on at all levels. Professors become policymakers, and policymakers become professors. So that also reinforces the link between power and knowledge. And so as in the meantime, the non-Western world, lacking resources, sending their students to the West, basically is reduced to being a follower. And they may even develop an inferiority complex, that all these things, and the Western ideas are superior. And you have to go to this Western university to qualify as being a professor or a trained academic in IR. But luckily that's changing now. As there is a global power shift, a lot of non-Western countries, especially China, but India as well, they have more resources. They can train their own people, and they can then dig into their own history. They publish journals. Western publishers are also publishing out of Delhi and Beijing, and new journals, new book publishing houses coming up. So there is a bit of a shift now, but it is far from complete.
Great point, and I'm particularly happy that you brought up the name Henry Kissinger, because I was actually thinking about exactly the same name thinking about his book World Order, I think it was, where the whole introductory basically was drawing upon Western concepts as the Westphalian system. And I want to ask you, do you think that this is also due to a certain laziness, I would say, and this structural force of many scholars, and to apply these concepts because they're so well known and they're so easy to understand, so common knowledge, kind of, that many people and scholars just draw upon these ideas without really critically assessing them? Do you think we need to be more challenging ourselves in the discipline?
Well, I won't use the word laziness, but it does create certain amount of inertia, that certain concepts are known and they're considered universal, so you internalize them. It's like almost like a Gramscian notion of hegemony. You have internalized the dominance of the Western ideas, and this is also a legacy of colonialism. And you think the West has got all the right answers to the problem. So Western IR theory has got all the answers. You can apply these realist concepts or liberal concepts to all over the world, and they fit. So, and why challenge it? So it's kind of more like a internalization rather than laziness and inertia. And but it does create at a certain level, not for everybody. If there are people who are creative, they're always looking for new ideas, challenging them all. But when the scholars in the West challenge existing ideas, they still keep it within the boundaries of Western dominance. So it's whether it's a balance of power worked or the concept of power worked, Congress of Vienna worked. So it's moving from one Western experience to another, whether it is free trade under Britain or free trade under the United States, whether it is the American style of democracy or British style of democracy. The variation, the diversity is all within the same paradigm, same world order. Very few people go beyond the existing world order. So my former colleague, Robert Cox, coined this very famous word. They call problem-solving theory and critical theory. So every IR student should read this. Robert Cox's distinction between problem-solving and critical is also discussed in my book. Problem-solving theory is when you try to change things but within the same order. So like moving from balance of power to concept of power. But critical theory is when you go beyond the existing order and challenge, like the whole capitalist system, or whole idea of the liberal order, or whole paradigm of the West, and really introduce revolutionary new ideas. Most academics don't do that. And that could be the inertia, if not laziness, because academics are very creative, and they want to publish articles, they have to always come up with new concepts. But most of the time, it's within the same paradigm, and very rarely it is sort of what is called Cox would call critical theory. Most of the time, it's problem-solving theory, not critical theory.
Yeah. Thank you. We have one more question from our listeners and viewers. Rory asks, could you give your thoughts on where human rights and its proclaimed universality fit into the Western-centric IR?
Yeah, I think that's also a very fundamental question. So there are people in the West, a lot of very, thinking people, very deep thinking people. They think human rights were invented in the West, but they are universal. So when they talk about human rights, or even the history of liberals, so it started with the West. So it's the Magna Carta and the transition from feudalism to capitalism, then Renaissance, and especially Enlightenment. And then it becomes, these ideas were invented or created in the West, becomes universal. So that's the concept of universalism, which we can associate with the Enlightenment, with Kant, which basically means one set of ideas applies to all. But those ideas came from the West. Everybody else should accept them because they are the best ideas. So even Kant, who actually opposed colonialism, but thought that the non-Western countries should come up to the level of the West to deserve independence and sovereignty. That, to me, is problematic. because another way of looking at human rights or liberal ideas is that to think that they have multiple origins. So West is one point of origin, but there are traditions. It depends on how you define, narrowly you define human rights. If you define human rights as property rights, that's what Magna Carta was about. Like the feudal lords demanded that the kings do not take away their property rights, leave them alone. And that became the basis of the Magna Carta. So if you define human rights in that narrow terms of property rights, and then led to the transition to capitalism, you can say that is something uniquely Western about it. But if you think of human rights as protection of our lives, dignity of the people, that every tradition, every religion, every culture has approximations to human rights. Just like the West did not accept human rights all the time, but even if you have property rights, the king and the queen is still, call you up and execute you and take away your liberty right until 19th, 20th century. Same thing happened in the other way around. There are feudal traditions. There are traditions in China or India where, yes, there are absolute rule of kings and emperors, but there are also protection for people. So King Ashoka of India, for example, had edicts in many parts of the world when he converted to Buddhism, where he said in the injunction against cruel and unjust punishment, exact words, that the people of my country should be protected against cruel and unjust punishment. The idea of how to treat soldiers in battlefield or civilians in the battlefield, which is one aspect of human rights, and it's kind of more like Geneva Conventions. Manu's laws of Manu provided detailed injunctions or protections for civilians in wartime. You can find some similar things in Confucianism. You can find similar things in Zoroastrianism, in Persian tradition. So my point is that human rights, certainly West has made a lot of contribution, but to say that it is Western, but everybody should accept it in this way and it's universal, first of all, it's not right, and also it's a bad way of selling things. If you say, hey, I created this, but you accept it because it applies to you, I will be, you would say, what the heck, why should I accept your ideas? But if you say, hey, both you and I have a share in the invention of creation of these ideas, we build this home together, so let's manage it together, then you will be much more inclined to actually take responsibility for this. So I think the Western discourse on human rights have become too partial, partly very adversarial, shaming and naming, throwing a boomerang, as they say, boomerang effect. And I actually have a different way of talking about human rights, and I call it the banyan effect, which is the Indian tree. Banyan has a large canopy, it is inclusive, it has roots going up to down and down to up, and multiple roots, and it's much more of a universalist metaphor than this idea of throwing a boomerang. When you want to hit a human rights abuser, you throw a boomerang at that. I think a more inclusive way of capturing the genesis of human rights and what you call the genealogy of human rights is actually gives you a better way of actually making it more universal. I'm not saying that human rights are not abused in the non-Western world, and the international community is right to protest against gross abuses of human rights and genocide, and which has happened both in the West in the past and now, mostly in the non-Western world. But I still think when you actually try to propagate the idea of human rights, it's better to have a more inclusive story than an adversarial us versus them story.
Yeah, thank you. I think in the last answers you have drawn several times now upon your new book project, and maybe you tell us a bit about what your current research, your current book is about.
So thank you. That gives me a chance to talk about my my work as I'm doing now. So I've just published the second edition of a book called The End of American World Order. And the book basically says that the Western dominance of the world order is coming to an end. That's partly because of the rise of the rest, countries like China, India, but it's also because of certain kind of structural long-term changes in the global economy and global politics. Now, we have a now 5,000-year history in the world, and 400 of those 5,000 years were dominated by the West. So obviously, before that, other civilizations were dominant. China was a dominant country, a major power, #1 economy for almost 1,000 years. Other countries have the Islam invented globalization. Indians gave a lot of ideas and also trade. So the history of civilizations from a long-term perspective has many ups and downs. So the Western dominance, which is identified with the rise of Britain and the United States, is coming to an end. I focus on the United States. So it's called the end of American world order. So the key argument is very simple, that I'm not saying that America itself is declining. That evidence is indeterminate. But the American-built world order is declining. And that order was built after 1945, and some people call it liberal world order. I call it the American-led liberal order. And because the rise of other countries, but also that order was always contained contradictions. For example, it was never really a global order. For much of its history, it was a club of the West. It's the West European countries, United States, Australia, Canada, and maybe Japan as a sort of invited member. Countries like China, India were outside of the liberal order for much of their history. And then they become part of the economic part of the liberal order after reforms in China and India. But China was never part of the political part of the liberal order. And I also point out to other structural factors leading to the decline and end of what is called liberal hegemony, American-led liberal hegemonic order. Now, I wrote this book and published it in 2014. Before anybody had thought about Trump, seriously about Trump being president. But then Trump becomes president in 2016, and people suddenly, a lot of people say, oh, the liberal order is coming to an end. And so my argument in the second edition, which just came out 2 weeks ago, is that Trump is a consequence rather than the cause of the end of the liberal order. That these signs posts of the liberal order coming to an end or declining are already evident to a lot of people, but the liberal scholars and policymakers were not, they were kind of not acknowledging it. Maybe they were slipping through it. Because Barack Obama was president, and people that Hillary Clinton will take over from Obama and continue this liberal internationalist policy. But that is gone now. And Trump is not the cause of the crisis of liberal order, but he's the consequence, because he took advantage of some of the aspects of liberal order, like globalization, for example, which is hurting some large sections of American people. And he exploited that to become president, win the presidency. But once he is president, he can push it over the edge, and he's doing that. But we can't blame him for the crisis of the liberal order, but we can certainly say he is doing his best to finish it off, basically give the last nail on its coffin. And this book is out. I also talk about alternative forms of world order. So I said, instead of liberal hegemony or multipolarity, people think after American hegemony we have multipolarity. I am arguing that multipolarity is an outdated term. It talks about great powers. It talks about distribution of power. There's much more things going on in the world today than just distribution of power. So I talk about complexity. So multiple actors with complex relationships, complexity, complex interdependence. Like you go to a multiplex cinema and you have a choice of different movies, different actors and producers, rather than being confined like in the 1950s when you have choice of one movie at a time. So we have in a multiplex can be in a multiplex cinema or Netflix, where you can actually have a choice of films sitting in your home, or it can be also multiple actors with complex interdependence. We have so many different actors, states, non-state, international organizations, which never existed to that extent in the 19th century. So then so distribution of power is important, but it's only one aspect of world order. All this complexity, transnational challenges, actors, interdependence, regional levels of governance, as well as global levels of governance, creates a complexity where we have a dispersal of power, a decentralization of power, but at the same time, complexity of linkages. And I call it multiplex world. And that's basically also a major theme of the book. So the ending of the American-led liberal order and the beginning of a multiplex world.
That is interesting for me, looking at your whole career, because you have been starting, as we talked about that earlier, with analyzing and going into academic discourses in international relations and observing also kind of a decline of Western-made concepts and Western IR hegemony as well. So your work can be seen under these lenses as well. Now you're going away from academic discourses into political power. In this book that you were just describing, do you connect those two themes, and how does it work out?
I think you are right in saying that I'm moving a little away from a strictly sort of academic theory-driven work to a work that has more a wider audience and that can inform public debate. I'm not giving up on academia completely. So I have a lot of my work is still academic, but this particular book is a crossover between the sort of pure academic world and the world of public debate or public intellectual. So, but I'm still drawing concepts from the academic world, like liberal order theories, but I am explaining them in a way that will be accessible to an informed audience. And I want to do more of that, because I think as an academic, I feel that we have an obligation to, the academics have a lot of knowledge. I'm talking about my colleagues and all over the world. They spend an enormous amount of time studying different countries, different issues. They're the best experts in the world on different issues. But the media doesn't take advantage of it. Newspapers in some countries they do a little bit, but United States, the media ignores academics. When you go to watch, when you watch CNN or MSNBC or Fox News and some crisis in Iran, or they will look at it from the prism of politics, and they will bring in a Republican strategist and a Democratic strategist and have a debate. Whereas there are great academics who spend years and years studying Iran or Syria, sitting right in the city in the United States. They don't get invited. So that's partly our fault as academics. We don't try to communicate in the language that media can understand. I don't want to sort of demean, say anything derogatory about media's lack of appreciation of academic concepts, but it's a question of writing style, a question of outreach, and lack of time. We are busy academics teaching and research, but I think there is still a lot more can be done, and the media can take advantage of us, and we can take media as a platform for propaganda, trade on ideas to a larger audience. I'm not trying to be a media pundit, but I simply think books and articles can be read by a wider audience, and it will inform public debate. Right now, the debate is too narrow because it's only coming from the media attention, or pundits are very short term. Think tanks only look at the latest development. Rarely they go back, delve back into history and draw out long-term trends. This is a comparative advantage of academics. So when I talk about the end of American world order, I am looking at a long-term phenomenon. And again, in 2014, I had said that the liberal order is in crisis, in a terminal crisis. And now that's what is happening. So we can actually, I'm not saying I predicted Trump. I didn't know that Trump is going to be elected. But I certainly thought my argument is Trump-proof. Trump or no Trump, it's a question of how often, how soon this might happen. That liberal order was in crisis. So we can actually have a comparative advantage, we are, meaning academics, providing long-term informed analysis for the public, which will give the public a wider menu of choice or stories and a diversity of perspectives, which I'm afraid is not happening, is not available now. And that is what is motivating me to go in this direction.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That were a lot of insights. I've one question that kind of connects a lot of things that you were drawing on, but also might give students that are watching this at home an idea of what can be done, or what how we can work with these problems and with these challenges that come up in our discipline. looking at international relations, we also have a discipline where we have an hegemony in terms of where the universities are, where you're hired at, where to which universities you have to go in order to be recognized in the academic community, in order to develop theories, which is mainly in Western countries as well. And I was discussing this recently with colleagues. Do you believe that this change also in academia is only possible when we break up also this power structure of Western universities being the main providers of impulses of new theories? Do we have to structurally also rethink on strengthening university systems and IR, particularly in non-Western countries?
I think yes. I think the world is changing, and the power. There's a global power shift, to put it very broadly. So a lot of countries which were poor and underdeveloped are developing faster than Western countries. There's kind of I don't say convergence, but there is a leveling of the economic gap between the rest and the West. And some of the countries ahead of others in terms of not all developing countries or non-Western countries are doing well, but some are doing very well, and they're closing the gap. And so from a very purely practical purpose, you need to know about that. I mean, can you think of living in a 21st century world if you don't know Chinese history? Because this is the number 2 or number 1 economy now, depending on how you count, and the largest country in the world. How can you ignore its history, its culture? And same goes for India or other countries in like Brazil or South Africa or Nigeria, Turkey, Indonesia. So I think from a practical point of view, it's important for universities to retool themselves. And instead of reading only the classics of Greece and Rome, they should pay attention to the history of the other countries as well. And then the other thing is, in terms of theories and knowledge, it's also prepared students better for taking advantage of the global market. If you're getting a job these days, I mean, countries that are opening up like crazy. China, before we had Singapore and still have Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, now China, and there are all kinds of opportunities in the non-Western world. And universities should prepare their students to be ready for developing careers in these other parts of the world. And then thirdly, I think there is also a normative aspect to it. I mean, for too long, international relations have been identified with Western dominance. It's almost like a neo-colonial project. That the assumption that all good knowledge and important knowledge in the West, and the rest is basically a follower of that knowledge. Rest has nothing to contribute, and that's not right historically. It might have been right for the last 100 or 200 or 300 years, but as I said, non-Western countries created a lot of the knowledge that the West used to move ahead, like Islamic ideas, Islam's contribution to globalization, China's inventions, Islam's knowledge of philosophy, which was also based on preserving but advancing on ideas from Plato and Aristotle, or medicine. India's contributions to philosophy, religion, and also mathematics. All these things were very important for the development of the West before the West actually could claim to be the dominant region of the world. So now that we have a shift again, and these countries are coming back, West should try to learn about them, not only for just a practical point of view, but also from a normative point of view, and redress this what is called the intellectual racism, or the intellectual hegemony, and again create inequality. And this is fundamental to creating kind of a communication between civilizations and maintaining peace. So it's also a normative commitment for universities to be more inclusive and pay attention to diversity in international politics. Okay.
Thank you very much for being here with us today. It was really great that you stood with us so long, answered all my questions and all our viewers' questions. I hope to see you soon again here.
I hope it was useful, and thank you very much for having me. So I hope what I said will be useful to our audience, and good luck. This is a great project.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.